So welcome all of you online to this release event of the third survey conducted by the Nordic Business Ethics Initiative. And I'm standing here with lovely Nina, and I can't believe it's already a year ago since we had the first virtual launch. And since then, we've really gone viral and learned how to interact with all of you in the virtual space, because we had the virtual launch, we had Andy Fasta with us. I hope many of you were there. It was an amazing event. Since then, we have had 2 virtual Nordic Business Ethics Days, and I think, Nina, 3 live discussions as well. Today we are calling this a community event, and we are joined by, I think, close to 500 persons who have signed up. And today we also have many of you contributing in various forms. So we are super excited about this and to be here with all of you. But Nina, what is going to happen today?
Yes. So this is the third survey, as Anna mentioned, and those who have been following us knows that we've done twice already a survey from the employee perspective. So really trying to understand how employees within different organizations perceive ethics at work. So this year we thought that let's do something different. And instead of looking at the wide perspective, we actually this year focused on inside organizations and how organizations actually manage their ethics and compliance programs. And we have very interesting findings for many of the questions that ethics and compliance professionals are thinking about. How to get organized, to whom report to, what kind of sizes and capabilities do the ethics and compliance teams have, or do companies even have ethics and compliance officers? So all of this is in the scope of this survey that we are launching today. And we are hoping that, as Anna mentioned, that this will be a very interactive session. So first of all, you can find the survey already from our website. So just go to the nordicbusinessethics.com and survey, and you can download the report right now and follow the panel discussions while reading the survey. And if you have any questions regarding the survey or to our amazing guests today, please use the chat to share your thoughts, ask questions, and be interactive part of this community. Because, as Anna mentioned, we are almost 500 people joining the stream today. If you're using social media, feel free to tag us, so you can find from us from all of the channels with the Nordic Biz Ethics. And then also you can use the hashtags NBE Survey 2021. And before we actually go into the survey itself, we thought with Anna that let's not do the traditional way and present the survey ourselves, but instead we are actually inviting here a lot of key people from the field to discuss with us the survey results. And but before we actually go into the program, so we often get this question that, what motivates us to be part of this community and part of the NBE. So Anna, what is your motivation?
It's a broad question. How much time do we have?
About 1.5 minutes. So.
Yeah. But I would say, I think as perhaps many of us, I sort of ended up in this field a bit by accident. I do think, if we're honest, a decade ago, when many of us started to work with this wasn't the most popular field. It wasn't even an established profession. And I'm so happy, Nina, that we today have many of these pioneers with us here today. For example, we have Kati and Maria, who were establishing this Finnish compliance network. So they're here with us today. We have Helena from the Swedish Anti-Corruption Institute, and Pontus from Stora Enso, who probably is one of the first ethics and compliance officers that I got to know even before I sort of officially transitioned into this field. So I would say, it's one motivation for me is really the community. I mean, all the amazing people that are working with this. And the second motivation is really the why we do this. I'm super passionate about the why, and that we are trying to push organizations to become more responsible, to take ethical considerations when decisions are made, to not only be short-sighted and consider here and now, but to think about the consequences and also about the impact that companies have on societies, on human rights across the globe. So yeah, I would say shortly the why we do this, and then all the amazing people that I have met during this year. That's what keeps motivating me. So what motivates you, Nina?
Well, I could say the same thing, and in a way, I think I'm happy to have Kati here in the studio, because Kati was actually for me the first person who I ever met almost 10 years ago when I started in this field. So really being part of the community, that is also something new and that is all the time evolving. It was very different 10 years back than what it is today when we talk about ethics and compliance programs. And also maybe as a personal motivation for me, I think it's like, what could be more interesting task to think about than these very human considerations that we have to deal with when we are talking about ethics? Like, none of us is perfect, and we all have our own ethical struggles, and you in a way have to every day reinvent being ethical once again, and helping myself, helping companies, helping other people to think about this. I think it's just that's enough motivation. But I think that before we actually go into the report and the panels, so one thing we must do is to once again thank our amazing partners. So we are very lucky to have many partners who share the same aim with us, and who sees that doing this Nordic Business Ethics Initiative is worth of being part of. So thank you so much for all of our great partners for also enabling this event. So Forensic Risk Alliance, Swedish Chamber of Commerce, my speaker, Hannes Nelman, Frank Partners, and EQS. And
Nina, before we move on, I mean, we have a couple of panels. So we do have the first panel discussion that will dive into the topic of governance and how to structure the ethics and compliance function, and which topic areas to work with, and so on. And then secondly, we will go really deep into practice, sort of the panel that I will chair. We will look at how do you make sure that what you do actually has an impact in reality. And then finally, we are going to conclude with some new perspectives, because I'm sure many of you have read, and you're watching or seeing on LinkedIn and in different venues the discussion on ESG and this question mark around how is ESG, environment, social and governance, the topic relating to ethics and compliance, and what is our role in this field? And that's what we're going to conclude with, and then share some new perspectives and ideas there. But before we do so, since this is a community event, we wanted to take a moment to acknowledge an old friend of ours, and a professional colleague to many of you, Zakia Serguro from Frank Partners, who I know many of you work together with. And I'm sure many of you also know that Zakia left us all too early. She succumbed to complications of COVID-19 last spring, and we are really saddened by this. She had a true passion for business integrity and a real drive to push corporations. And I know when I worked with her, she asked many challenging questions from me and helped me to sort of grow in my thinking of the consequences of, for example, using certain business partners and so on. And we want to acknowledge Zakia and her great intellect. She was such an inspiration. We have published one podcast with her where we talk about South Africa and challenges doing business in Africa. And me and Nina, we actually found 2 unpublished recordings with Sakia, where we are talking about, the struggle around different type of business partners, and we actually talk about M&A and the responsibility that you have as a corporation in that regard. And we are thrilled to release this sort of special edition today. So you can find this podcast or these episodes with Sakia on our webpage, and also we will send out a link to those. So we really hope that you will go in and listen and be inspired. I think Sakia will continue to inspire all of us.
Yes. So it's time to explore our report, not just the 2 of us, but all of us together. So just as a quick reminder, please find the report from our website. Use the chat to post questions to us and to our panelists. We will start with the first panel with the amazing ethics and compliance veterans who have been real pioneers in this field. I will introduce the full panel later on. But before the panel discussions, we will have a short keynote from Maria Vasastjärna, who is a partner at Hannes Snellman. And actually, Maria is also one of the pioneers in this field. Before becoming a trusted partner, she used to also work in-house in Nokia Corporations most recently, and is also a very early member of the Finnish Ethics and Compliance Professional Network. And right after then Maria's keynote, we will start the first panel. But before we do this, we want to share with you some greetings from the Ethics and Compliance Network.
As each and every one of us is responsible for following our values and the code of conduct, my domain is our company as a whole. So every day I get inspired by working together with my colleagues in all levels in the organization and throughout the continent.
To me, one of the best things about working in ethics and compliance is actually not one thing, but 2 things. Firstly, working with change management and creating a more sustainable way of doing business is very important to me. Secondly, working with ethics and compliance means that you are working with all parts of the organizations and give you a unique opportunity to also influence the organizations. That is also very important to me and one of the best things about working in ethics and compliance.
The best thing about working with ethics and compliance is that it's never boring. First, we are dealing with a wide variety of topics, and our scope is consistently growing. So we are never really sure what our priorities will be from one week to the next. And we also learn every day. Then ethics and compliance touches upon all functions within a company. So we are lucky enough to work with a lot of different people with different backgrounds and mindsets. And last, ethics and compliance is also about trying to influence people and their behavior. I would say that this is the biggest, but also the most exciting challenge that we have as ethics and compliance professionals.
Having worked in the compliance functions at Immerse, IBM, as well as Bench, I'm at the Rijksmuseum, and as you can see behind me is the famous Night Watch. The Night Watch was a civil guard. They helped to protect the citizens of Amsterdam, so they were one of the lines of defense, and that's what is best for me in terms of ethics and compliance, is that we are a line of defense. We help to protect the company as well as our colleagues by designing and implementing effective compliance programs. So for me, what's best about ethics and compliance is being able to make a difference in helping to shape the ethical culture of the companies where I work at.
Compliance gives us license to operate, and the best in the ethics and compliance work is to support businesses proactively to do business, support their ethical business decisions, and to support them in the regulatory compliance. Every day is different and inspiring.
To me, it means being close to the core business where things happen. And at my current work at one of Europe's premier health facilities, that means being able to support all the awesome co-workers out there in the organization by simplifying, structuring, and guiding in relations to the regulations we need to follow. And most importantly, to continue to build a long-term ethics and compliance culture alongside with safety as our number one priority.
You for having me. And I was already kindly introduced. My name is Maria Vasasjärn and I'm a partner at Hannes Snellman in Helsinki. Before I'll talk about the topic of governance and the setup of the ethics and compliance function, I want to thank Nina and Anna for the fantastic work that they're doing with the Nordic Business Ethics Initiative and the survey in particular. This is such an important effort that benefits all of us working with compliance. So thank you, ladies. Now for the next 10 minutes or so, I'll talk about regulatory expectations on governance and program design. This will not in any way be exhaustive, but rather you can think of it as a presentation of some of the key issues to consider, and this will hopefully feed into the panel discussion that follows. So I'll try to raise some points or questions, also in light of the interesting data coming out of the NBE survey that we can then take with us to discuss in the panel. I'll start by stating the obvious. Despite the significant amounts and efforts spent on various compliance efforts, training programs, hotlines, and other systems designed to prevent and detect violations, corporate misconduct continues to happen. We've all seen how compliance scandals continue making headlines. If we look at the recent developments and approaches in enforcement practice, many agencies today take active steps to incentivize compliance programs and include them, for example, as mandatory conditions in infringement decisions. Knowing that frequent regulatory intervention is the norm, compliance officers have to keep track of regulatory changes and enforcements, and not just locally or here in the Nordics, but even from a global perspective. Especially if you're operating globally as a company, you may need to adopt a holistic approach to your program design. And in this regard, what works for quite many compliance professionals today as guiding principles or standards is the US Department of Justice, or the DOJ, policy on compliance programs. And it provides quite detailed guidance and is based on the authority's own experience and feedback, both from the business and compliance communities. When considering regulatory expectations on governance and compliance program design, there are certain key points I want to mention today. Increasingly, in design and maintenance of compliance programs, regulators expect adequacy and effectiveness. So what does this mean? Regulators expect that a compliance program is being implemented effectively. An effective implementation in this context can be translated into the program being adequately resourced and compliance personnel being empowered to function effectively. The expectations are that a company's compliance officer or manager can act with sufficient authority. And what this means in practice is that you have adequate autonomy, seniority within the organization, and sufficient resources. Because even a very well-designed program will not work if it's under-resourced. Companies need to be prepared to justify the choices made in how their programs have been structured within the overall business community. So this point of autonomy, compliance, resourcing, and reporting lines is also highlighted in the NBE survey, as we can see, where it's questioned whether Nordic organizations are separating enough compliance responsibilities from the legal function. On the slide, we see the questioning whether corporate or commercial lawyers are autonomous enough from the business operations to challenge ethically problematic conduct or decisions. And I'll just wait for the slide to change so we get that quote. Thank you. And moving on, as the survey also highlights, regulators may look for information about declined investments and budget limitations. So what this means for companies is that they need to make sure that they can defend team size, budget, and approach. When we talk about expectations on autonomy and compliance resourcing, this may mean for some companies that it's worth considering the following questions. Should we perhaps restructure ethics and compliance teams to ensure functional independence from the business? Should we perhaps create subcommittees of the board, such as an ethics and compliance committee that provides independent oversight of the company's compliance program? Should we appoint an ethics and compliance officer or create other new compliance roles, which would also mean the recruitment of experienced senior compliance professionals? Finally, should we change or actually reorganize the reporting lines to the General Counsel, the Ethics and Compliance Committee, or directly to the board? If we continue, regulators' expectations that a compliance program is being implemented effectively requires that the program is not only well designed and looks good on paper, but also applied in practice and has an impact on daily decisions. This means that compliance programs cannot be static, but rather we should be dynamic and adopt a continuous review approach. So risk assessment should be regular and result in changes made to policies and procedures. Regulators may actually look at an evolution of company policies and procedures that reflect the outcomes of these risk assessments. So here it's critical for compliance teams also to document how those changes reflect the results of their reviews. Relating to this, I think one interesting takeaway regarding program design from the DOJ guidance that I referred to earlier is that the guidance emphasizes that companies must track and incorporate into its risk assessment not only lessons learned from its own compliance issues or challenges, but also issues facing other companies in the same industry or region. So in other words, compliance teams will be expected to stay up to date on problems facing also other companies. When considering expectations on governance and program design, we of course need to include training and whistleblowing lines, and we need to think about their effectiveness too. When it comes to trainings and their effectiveness, we can ask ourselves, is the company evaluating the effect of its training on employee behavior or operations? And is the training providing a mechanism for employees to ask questions arising out of the training materials, irrespective of format used, so including e-learnings? And then concerning whistleblowing lines, we see from the NBE survey that anonymous whistleblowing systems are well in place today, which is probably a result of the EU directive for whistleblower protection. But the survey notes that the number of reported cases could be higher. So when considering effectiveness of the whistleblowing line, a company should perhaps test not only whether the line is being used, but also employees' awareness of the hotline, including whether they feel comfortable using it. Finally, let's touch upon the important issue of measurement of compliance programs. Because sometimes companies produce large binders of policies and procedures, but they don't have evidence of having tested those or tracking how many breaches they've experienced. And we could even go as far as to say that compliance programs are not effective without effective measurement of outcome and meaningful results. So when trying to assess program effectiveness quantitatively, it's been shown that companies tend to make some typical mistakes, and I want to mention just a few. For example, sometimes what is being used are incomplete metrics or invalid metrics. As an example, for example, to back up the claim that management has a very strong commitment to compliance, companies may cite the number of pro-compliance communications that their executives have sent out or issued. But then such a metric may prove invalid if employee surveys show lack of trust in management or a belief that whistleblowers face retaliation. Another typical fault is mistaking legal accountability for compliance effectiveness. So while compliance policies serve, of course, an important legal function, forcing them into legal frameworks could limit their ability to positively influence employee behavior. So one key question is, how do we create models that can credibly evaluate the impact of a compliance program? I think we need to recognize that our programs have multiple purposes. We can still stay on the previous slide. Our programs have multiple purposes. Firstly, to prevent misconduct. Secondly, to detect misconduct. And thirdly, to align corporate policies with laws and rules. So each component of a program should be linked to one of these objectives. For example, training serves to prevent misconduct. Whistleblower hotlines are designed to detect it, and then codes of conduct strive to align employee behavior with company policies and external regulations. So clearly identifying the goals of each can help us create meaningful metrics. And then we can move on to conclude or summarize. And I just want to repeat the issues that we have touched upon, because there were quite many, and I want to feed these into the panel discussion starting soon. So what are the key issues when it comes to meeting regulatory expectations regarding governance and program design? First, the requirement of effective implementation of a compliance program, which means that there should be adequate resourcing and the compliance function needs to be empowered. So we have the expectations concerning autonomy and empowerment. And these mean that we need to look at our compliance resourcing and the reporting lines that we have in place. Also, our program cannot be static. We need to adopt a dynamic program with regular periodic risk assessments. We're also expected to have effective trainings and whistleblowing lines in place. And finally, effective measurement of the program is key. And of course, as you all know, documenting all of this appropriately. In addition, I cannot avoid mentioning the benefits working together with external counsel in tackling these issues. And I say that also in my role as former in-house counsel dealing with compliance issues, ranging from investigations and risk assessments to trainings and creating and rolling out a global compliance program. And related to this, something important that is sometimes overlooked is LPP, or legal professional privilege. And it's a special status granted to advice and a correspondence exchanged with an external legal advisor. And when I say that this is sometimes overlooked, what I mean is that companies can sometimes get themselves into unnecessary trouble by creating very problematic email chains where there's speculation about possible wrongdoings. And LPP protects documents from disclosure to third parties, and it can, for example, be important to ensure this protection when you are conducting investigations, risk assessments, or compliance due diligence. And before I finish and we move on to the panel, let's take a quick look ahead. And we can see that the compliance field is becoming no less complicated or demanding. And as we heard in the video greetings, it continues to be challenging and always new issues to solve. And when considering expectations on corporate conduct, we have the ever important global frameworks to refer to, such as the UN Global Compact and UN Sustainable Development Goals on what companies should strive for in relation to society, the environment, and human rights. And concerning human rights, what's ahead are new EU human rights requirements, as the European Commission is soon expected to put forward its directive on mandatory due diligence, focusing in particular on third parties and addressing companies' responsibility and accountability for environmental and human rights impact. And this new legislation is very interesting. It would extend companies' duty of care substantially. So we will see more ESG initiatives come into play. And I believe we'll also hear later today about how to connect ESG with ethics and compliance. But for me, it's now time to say thank you for your attention. And I look forward to discussing these issues with my co-panelists, Pontus and Kati.
Thank you, Maria. It was such a nice to see the results of our survey presented for the first time in your presentation. So thank you for picking up the good parts. I mentioned earlier that this is all about being human, and I actually forgot one very important thing in our introduction. So really about our survey. So it was responded by you guys. So we got over 100 responses from the network, from the people who are responsible for ethics and compliance programs. So thank you for making this survey happen also by providing your insights. And as a tip, so anyone, feel free to use these survey results in your presentations, like Maria was showing a great example. But hey, now it's time for the first panel. So we will be here joined. Maria will be as part of our panel, and then Kati and Pontus will join us as well. So Kati Mattila, as I mentioned, is one of the pioneers in Finland for building ethics and compliance programs. So during the past 10 years, she's been heading the ethics and compliance teams at Kone Corporation, Telia Company, and currently at Kone Cranes. So she is a true veteran, and very happy to have Kati you here in the studio. And then we have the Swedish pioneer Pontus Sedelman also online. So Pontus has been at Stora Enso since 2007, building the group Global Ethics and Compliance program ever since. And Pontus has been a very active member in the Swedish ethics and compliance community since the day one. So welcome all to the panel. Very happy to have you all here. And our topic today is the governance and setup of ethics and compliance function. So first, I'd like to start with some of the findings from our survey. So we know that when we talk about ethics and compliance, it's a very wide area and broad concept. So we have APC, investigations, trade compliance, antitrust, privacy, AML, and so on. And in the survey findings, you can see the different areas that are covered in the Nordic ethics and compliance programs. So it's not self-evident to determine what's in it and who's responsible for what. So how do you do the scoping when actually defining the roles and responsibilities, and how do you make this a seamless process for the employees? Kati, I would love to hear your insights on this one.
Thanks, Nina. And of course, I think in a way, as the table here shows, there are certain very common nominators for all companies. So it seems that most of the companies, the compliance and ethics teams are responsible for the business ethics as well as code of conduct related matters, as well as anti-bribery and anti-corruption and investigations and whistleblowings. But then when we move to privacy, when we move to antitrust issues, trade compliance, there we already see quite a lot of differences between companies. And it can be that in a way it's not the compliance team who is responsible for these topics, but there is legal, there is HR, for example, or it can be finance or some other teams who are responsible. If I now put myself into the shoes of our employee, is this a mess? How do we communicate this in a manner that really makes sense from the employee's point of view? And this is something that if we really just focus on our own topic, I love my compliance topic, do we really remember that, hey, actually what we say and what we cover and how we deliver it, it needs to make sense from our employee's point of view. So I think it's quite important that we give quite careful thought to who is doing what, is even if compliance team is not responsible for all possible risks that you have covered in the code of conduct, how do you make sure that in a way it is aligned approach that we have? And I have to say, I really love holistic compliance programs. I think in a way that is the program that I want to enforce in my companies, because that makes sure that first of all, I know what my compliance risks are. I know that, okay, it may be anti-bribery and it may be chemical legislation, or it can be something else. But then in a way, I will make sure that we will work together in a way that we are able to deliver and manage the program so that it makes sense for every employee. They will get to hear what is relevant for them, and they will be delivered the message in a way that they actually understand, how does this affect my work? So I think it's quite important that you don't just in a way stick to a certain kind of a pre-standard model and this is the best for us as well, but you really give some thought into what makes sense considering the operational model, but also keeping in mind the risk of endangering your independence and integrity. I think Maria well pointed out that in a way that you need to consider the autonomy of the team, but also if you get too operational, if you get into designing everything, implementing everything, you get involved in all the decision making. How about, in a way, are you then jeopardizing your integrity in that respect? So that is something to really consider when deciding who is responsible for that and whether compliance team should be responsible for everything. Even though if the compliance program itself should cover everything, that is a different question comparing to who is doing what.
Exactly. Any thoughts from other panelists?
I can say a few words about this from my side as well. I think to start with, this goes without saying that you need to agree with the management and the board who is responsible for these different topics. And I mean, some cases are clear, but it's also a lot of borderlines, and more topics tend to come under the radar of compliance. For example, data privacy, for example, security of assets, etc., etc. And then I think it's very important also that this is a seamless process for the employees, because they don't really care if it's this or that organization that is responsible for the different topics. They need to sort of be able to sort of approach some kind of one-stop shop where they get all the assistance they need, which can, for example, be done in a website or so, where you point at certain people for different topics and for different responsibilities. So we can really help the employees without sort of arguing about different organizational questions and such things.
Yes, also aligned with Maria's presentation, if you can see now the survey findings for the expected competencies to be added in the future. So here, the most common new skill that the teams are looking for is the training and communication. So really the role of ethics and compliance teams have changed in this area as well. So this is a must-do for us. But hey, let's next talk about the organizational silos. So ethics and compliance officer, they may sometimes be seen as an sort of an ethics elite rather than guide inside the organization. And to build an effective compliance culture, we must make sure that the ethics and compliance really is present in all of different layers in the organization, and that the information actually flows within the layers, and that we have a consistent key message. And we certainly do need different platforms to discuss and address the ethics and compliance matters in various layers, whether it's the board or management, operational and employee levels. So, Pontus, how should we tackle this?
I think siloing is not a specific problem from ethics and compliance. I think all group functions have a tendency of sort of sitting in some kind of ivory tower and think about smart processes and guidelines, etc. And we in compliance also have a tendency of getting some kind of reputation of being sort of the ethics elite. in the company responsible for ethics and compliance. And I always protest against that, because we are not the ones being responsible for compliance. I mean, we are there to guide and to help and to give education and processes, etc. But responsible is everyone in the company. And I think we need to sort of break these silos in the company, both on a vertical and maybe also on a horizontal level. Horizontally, there are a lot of group functions that we can work together with. Just to give a few examples, HR, for example, and the fight against harassment and discrimination. We all know that discrimination and harassment are signs of other problems in the company as well. So there we have a lot to do together, so to say. Another example is the OHS function in the company, which is trying to change people's behavior when it comes to safety behavior and so forth. And there we have a lot to learn from each other on how to affect people's values. And then if we look on the vertical side of an organization, I think it's important that we are everywhere and on each level, so to say. I think most compliance functions are or have some kind of interface when it comes to the top management in the company. But there is also so that some companies tend to forget about the board, for example, which sounds strange, I would say. For example, engaging the board in the training, in the communication, etc., because it's in the board there where the sort of ultimate tone of the organization is set. We have also a tendency of forgetting about the operational level, and that's maybe even more problematic, because it's often on the operational level where the real problem occurs, so to say, and the real sort of decisions are made. And then finally, we also need to engage with the employees, and we can do that in different ways. One thing that I would like to promote is different kind of ethics ambassador networks, for example, or ethics navigators, or whatever you call them. It's extremely good to have this sort of second voice in the organization. I mean, compliance functions are often small, and as we could see in the report, have limited budget. And if we can expand the voice of compliance to a lot of employees, as you do in the ethics ambassador network, that is excellent to create changed values. So some thoughts from me on that.
Thank you, Pontus. Any thoughts from the rest of the panel?
Would you, Maria, like to go first?
Thank you, Kati. I was just thinking that the challenge with silos, I think, really relates to sort of basic human behavior, that we like to think that what we are working on, what we are specialized in, is the most important thing. And that's quite normal. But we need to remind ourselves that there's other things than compliance, or as my field of focus, competition law, and step out from that and interact across functions in the organization, outside the organization, sort of follow the business developments. And then, as Pontus mentioned, the employee interaction is really important. So exposing ourselves to influences from outside our compliance silo, if you want.
And if I shortly comment from my point of view, I think it is extremely valuable to consider how do we really embed the flavor of compliance and ethics into our regular business processes. Because in a way that is where it should be. If we just focus on our compliance and ethics program, it's very limited what we can do. But if we then are able to add the flavor of compliance into our HR processes, into our sales processes, in our everyday processes, that is where the rubber hits the road. That is when actually we are able to truly implement the processes and make sure that everybody actually follows. So and that is actually a good way of making sure that instead of having a very small compliance and ethics team, you will actually have tens of thousands of people with a side role as a compliance officer. That is a wishful thinking, I know, but of course, in a way, the key message is that instead of really focusing on our own processes, let's consider how do we adjust our normal business processes to address also the relevant compliance risks in an appropriate manner.
Exactly. And I've been many times in the situations where actually companies are a bit worried if anyone's interested in this sort of ethics and compliance ambassador roles. But at least my experience has been that it's quite nice role to have, and it's not actually difficult to get people to be part of the wider team. Great. But hey, at this point, I'd like to just remind the audience that we have still 10 minutes left of this great panel discussion. So if you have any questions to the panelists on this topic, so please use the chat to poll the questions. And let's next talk about the resourcing and the ethics and compliance teams. So what we found in the survey was that the 50% of the respondents thinks that limited budget and resources is the biggest challenge for the ethics and compliance team. And Anna will discuss more about these challenges. But if we think about now or talk about the organizational sizes, so actually, based on what we found was that 36% of the Nordic ethics and compliance teams, they only employ one person. So me, myself, and I. And of course, the good news is that the 45% expect to add resources. So at least the teams seem to be getting more resources. But the fact is that many organizations must utilize these internal resources to broaden the resources. So we really, as just discussed, we need to work across the organizations. And we'd like to also ask at this point a question from the audience. So you can find everyone who's online. You can find poll, which is under the chat function in the stream. So take a while to answer a question that which internal stakeholder group do you spend most time working with? And while we are getting the people joining us to answer this poll question regarding internal interactions, so let's ask a question from the external perspective. So Maria, you have an extensive experience both from the in-house work and also being a trusted advisor. So what are your experience from cross-functional collaboration? Are there some functions that are more important or perhaps more challenging than others to collaborate with?
Thanks, Nina. So my experience from cross-functional collaboration is that it's crucial and sometimes even completely necessary, at least when it comes to, for example, successfully managing compliance investigations. And in these situations, the HR function, the local HR manager, can be a key partner for you, in addition to, for example, the local business manager and, of course, the local legal. And sometimes the local finance manager and the support can be key in finding, for example, data as part of that compliance investigation. And then if we consider, in addition to investigations, for example, compliance trainings or rolling out the global e-learning in the organization, my experience, and now I'm thinking back when I was working still at Nokia, is that working very closely with the comms department, communications department, can be super helpful. And of course, having your business partners, the business managers, as your sounding boards when you think about how to frame the compliance messaging, and then you finding your local compliance promoters or ambassadors, maybe in the business heads, as was mentioned previously. And then, Nina, to your question, whether some functions are more important or more challenging than others to collaborate with, reflecting again, actually, back at my time at Nokia, there was a time when I happened to be the only person from the compliance function based in Finland, in the headquarters. So I remember, for me, during that period, absolutely the most important function was the legal function. And it was irreplaceable in finding partners in doing local compliance work. And for example, Nokia organizes this global integrity day. So we had pretty much the whole Finnish legal department there standing behind the desk and answering questions on compliance the full day, which was great. But I would like to finish by answering this question by noting that collaboration is key and successful when the other party is familiar with ethics and compliance and is genuinely interested in promoting compliance in the organization. So in the end, I think it's about people working well together, not so much perhaps in which function that person happens to be situated. So for us, working with compliance and compliance professionals struggling with limited resources, I think it's about reaching out and finding the right people in your organization that you can then team up with and get excited about compliance as well.
Thank you, Maria. Oh dear, always when you're in a good company, the time is running. So I think we need to move to the last question. And thank you all while taking the poll. So it seems that HR and legal are the most popular friends that the audience have within the organizations. But hey, finally, let's talk about reporting lines that have been already mentioned a few times. So based on what we found, so 50% of the ethics and compliance functions report solid line to general counsel. And it seems, and this was nicely referred also in Maria's presentation, that Nordic organizations could be lagging a bit behind in terms of separating ethics and compliance responsibilities from the legal function. And although their expectations on compliance to a large extent are coming from these legal obligations, regulators are increasingly looking at the autonomy of the ethics and compliance function. Of course, the commercial lawyers have their place and critical role in securing that legal obligations are complied with, but that might not be sufficient autonomous from the business operations to sufficiently challenge bad decisions from an ethical perspective. And thank you, Maria, also for already touch upon this topic. But anyway, here is the survey results, and this is how it looks like in the Nordics. So question to all of the panelists. So how do you make it so the reporting to the General Counsel work without compromising the autonomy? Would you like to Kati start?
Happy to do so. Thanks, Nina. I think that of course, in a way, the situation is what it is. That if you are reporting to the General Counsel, there are other ways also to make sure that actually you have your independence and that you are able to secure that position, and that can be done by having direct access to the board or the audit committee or similar committee of the board, making sure that actually there is a possibility to address topics that you might be a bit uncomfortable addressing if the management would be present. So I would in a situation like that, you can well establish alternative ways. But of course, I think that this is quite heavily dependent on the persons in question. How do they then feel that if there would be let's say, a whistleblowing report regarding the General Counsel? How do you manage the situation in a way? What is the expectation of the organization? Can you go directly to the CEO? Can you go directly to the board and have a discussion that now we have an extremely challenging situation? But that also in a way needs to be carefully thought through when you establish the role and when you consider what the reporting lines are. Not an easy question.
Exactly. Pontus, do you have a solution for us?
If I start with the relationship to legal as a whole, I think we should keep a distance to legal because in compliance we need to be questioned the decisions made by business, including the legal advice, so to say, and also in extreme cases investigate what has happened in the boardroom, for example. On the other hand, legal is sort of our a bit of a brother or sister organization, which are really helped by because they are lawyers. They know the legal requirements. They understand how to create values and things like that, and they are always sort of present where the important decisions are made. So, I mean, we should have some kind of organizational distance and independence from legal. On the other hand, I think it's very important that we all the time exchange thoughts with legal, for example, having trainings together, discuss ethical dilemmas, etc., etc. So they are sort of, we should keep them close, but from an organizational point of view, they should be separate as well. And then I fully agree with what you said regarding reporting lines, that this is very personal. I mean, what you want to avoid is to have some kind of filter between you and the board. So the message gets diluted. In my case, for example, I don't have that filter. My general counsel is more of a loudspeaker, so there is no problem in my case. But if the message is sort of blurred, then this is really something to consider.
Thank you, Pontus. It's easier to agree on that one. Maria, any final words for this one?
I think Pontus and Kati framed it so well. I have nothing to add at this stage. Perhaps one thing I could say is that when working with compliance in an organization, we think about how to train the employees, how to train the business, but then also stopping and at times reminding the legal function and the compliance function itself about this separation might be healthy, because we might forget that in the pace of doing all the other things working with compliance.
That's a great way to conclude this first panel. So I really want to thank all of you for joining. So it was a pleasure, always a too short time to have the discussion that would be nice to continue. But let's give some room for the panel number 2. And while Anna is getting prepared, let's watch again a few greetings from the Great Ethics and Compliance Network.
Hey, I like working with compliance and ethics because it's fun, it's inspiring, I become part of something much bigger. It can really make an impact.
I love working with ethics and compliance because I'm able to make an impact on an organization's culture, which transcends geographical borders.
What I think is the best thing with working in ethics and compliance, that is the sense of being part of and contributing to the efforts towards a more sustainable future. Because working to fight corruption and to ensure ethical business on the global arena, that is of course key if we are to even achieve the Agenda 2030 goals. And I love the idea of being just a small piece in that great puzzle. And I also think that the job is really fun.
To help the organization understand the compliance risk in their business operations and why it is important to do proper assessments, as well as continuously work on our awareness when it comes to responsible conduct at all levels.
The best thing with my work is the opportunity to work proactively and impact business and make sure we do business the right way, but also contribute to a sustainable development. It is a challenging and exciting role with a lot of responsibility, but no day looks the same. Thank you.
The best thing with working with ethics and compliance is the feeling of helping the organization do the right thing.
What is the best thing about working with ethics and compliance? For me, it is working with the people. There is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to ethics and compliance. In order to design or propose effective solution, it's really important to understand the people, the organization, and the culture. So for me, my favorite part about working with ethics and compliance is getting to know the people, getting to understand the organization, and to really become part of the culture. So, thank you.
So to me, the best thing about working with ethics and compliance is 3 things. So it's about people, it's about society, and it's about business. Helping doing the right thing, driving culture and transparency across the organization. Thanks.
The best thing about my job in ethics and compliance is that I can make a positive impact to the world by helping companies conduct their business in a responsible way.
So hello everybody, I hope you are as excited and inspired as I am. I think that was one of the things that we wanted with Nina, that this would be an inspirational event. It would not yet be yet another Zoom seminar, but really something where we could feel connected, we could feel that we are part of a larger group and that we have the same passion for our work. So I was really happy to see all of you that have contributed so far. And now we will go into the next session, which is taking sort of theory to practice, talking about governance and setup of our functions, and then how to make it real. And before I invite the full panel, I have the pleasure and honor to present to you Derek Patterson from Forensic Risk Alliance. Me and Derek, we go far back. I do think, Derek, I met you first in Uzbekistan under some shady circumstances when you were digging up data for the Telia case, and I was there, and pretty new in the field. So I would say, Derek, I have learned a lot from you. I've been really inspired by the work that you do, sort of a bit in the shadow, but so important. And we are so happy to have you here with us. And with that, over to you, Derek.
And it's a real pleasure and a delight to be joining this event. I'm really sorry I couldn't be up in the Nordics with you in person. That would have been much better, but here we are on Zoom. First of all, congratulations to you and to Nina for putting together this survey for the third time. We're delighted to be able to continue to support you in this. I think it's a fantastic initiative to be able to see the profile of ethics and compliance growing in the Nordics since back in those days that you referred to, 2014 and onwards. We can see the expertise in the professional group growing and the breadth of the group growing too, and all of this is fantastic. And this survey, I think, is a great touch point, a great temperature take of what's on the radar screen for people in a particular year. As you said, I work at FRA based in London. I've been coming to the Nordics for many years. I help companies with regulatory investigations, but also crucially, we help companies who are under monitorship to test the design and the implementation and effectiveness of their compliance programs. And I think that may be helpful and relevant experience that you've asked me to speak a little bit about here today. We've got some interesting questions that are about practice rather than the theory of ethics and compliance. And so when I was looking through your survey, I was looking for some points that were relevant to that. And actually, I'm rather pleased and confirmed that much of what I wanted to say is very consistent with what Kati and Pontus and Maria have all drawn out in the previous panel. So the first thing I was going to talk about was the size of teams. That's often what we're looking at. One of the first things we're looking at in any organization is what resources are devoted, what budget is approved, how many people are there, what kind of people are they. I see from the survey that 66% of teams have less than 5 people. So that's quite small. Even for the biggest companies, the largest companies, 50% of them have less than 5 people. So it's a good place to start, but still in the context, I think, of maybe more international compliance programs, it's a start and there's an objective to grow. And I was pleased to see that 45% of respondents are saying they're going to add employees, colleagues to the team. That's great news. But other ways to leverage small compliance teams have been very effectively discussed and put forward by the previous panelists. Internal collaboration is really important, and To legal and HR, who are highlighted as two of the most important, I would add others that we've seen being leveraged usefully by compliance and ethics teams. So internal audit can also be very helpful in assessing risk, but also in testing, which is vitally important in any program. But look a little bit further. If you go to IT and systems, you'll find someone in there who's very interested in improving systems, integrating systems, improving data transparency and control of transactions. Very useful people to get hold of. You can find ways of integrating and getting your objectives built into future systems improvements in the organization. Finance often have access to data for investigations, but also reporting, KPIs, metrics that may be of interest and of help to you from a compliance perspective. Very useful to get to know them. And there will also be people in the finance function who are interested in transactional controls and internal control systems. And these are also very important parts of any ethics and compliance program. In fact, they're right up there in the DPA that usually goes with any settlement, is that there's a strong internal control system in place. In the procurement department, I can bet you a fika bun, you'll find in there people who are interested and motivated in controlling the vendor base and finding ways of shrinking it, in being more efficient in terms of oversight and control of vendor onboarding, and oversight of whether vendors are active and the company is getting the best use and value from them. Find those people. A lot of what they do will be consistent with compliance controls and desires around third-party use, human rights standards, and anti-bribery standards, and so on. Even in sales, you'll find people who are interested in analysing and understanding the relative profitability of go-to-market. You'll be interested in those too, to understand where risk might fall and what kind of channels are being used in what parts of the world. And also you'll find there are people who are interested in getting transparency in and control over discounts, rebates, and odd sales deals. Those are also things that are very often on the radar screen of ethics and compliance. And then, of course, we touched on HR, who often have aligned interests, and particularly where there are remuneration schemes in place which emphasize compliance, then being able to tap into HR and how that program is running will be very, very effective. The second thing I wanted to highlight was that leveraging ambassadors. Pontus, I think you referred to that. We've seen this in a number of companies. In general, it's a great idea to be considering to get ambassadors or touch points or guidance people out in the organization. They're not necessarily part of your compliance network, but they are people who you can train, who you can accentuate risk to, who you know have got some level of capability of speaking up locally to influence business decisions in whichever business area they are. The one thing I'd say about those programs is don't go mad. We've seen them with hundreds of people in, and then it becomes very difficult to actually control and extract the value from that program. Keep it small for a start, but roll it out. Stay in touch with those people. Try and measure what they're doing. Try and get feedback from them. It's a very effective way of broadening your reach within the organization. The second major category, which was also touched on, is investigations. Practically speaking, these are, I think, maybe not a huge workload from the survey data, but with the introduction and rollout of whistleblower facilities across the EU and in other parts of the world, as employees and suppliers and customers become familiar with their existence and comfortable with using them, the level of instances of whistleblower will increase. And so I think this is a really important forum. Forums like this are great for sharing experience around how to triage the volume. What levels should you be seeing? How do you know whether it's working or not? What's the right level to take an investigation to? Never an easy question. And really importantly, how do you close an investigation and capture the right remediation points? That really wraps up the things that I had in mind that were of practical bearing from looking at the survey results. And now, Anna, I'll hand to you to introduce the rest of the panel and commence a discussion.
Thank you so much, Derek, for your valuable perspectives. And now I'm thrilled to invite two veterans, as we have taken the liberty to call our colleagues in the Nordic Business Ethics Network. So with us now in the discussion, we will have Agatha Butterweck from Norway. So Agatha has a really wide experience from various industries. So she's worked at Telenor, Norsk Hydro, then she was a consultant for a period, and now Agatha, you are with Aker Solutions. So we're really thrilled to have you with us.
Thank you.
And then we have Helena Sundén from Sweden. And Helena, I think you and me, we go way back as well. I think if I remember Derek from the Telia times, I remember you as well. You were sort of on the other side. I think the journalists, they loved to ask you a lot of questions because you were the chair for the Swedish Anti-Corruption Institute during the Telia scandal. So I think you gave a lot of expert opinions to the media during that time. And since then, Helena, you've had I think your career is impressive, really moving across different contexts. So first really from being more a public advocate, and then you've been in stock-listed companies and at Skanska, and now you are at the Karolinska University Hospital, which is a really interesting context to work with ethics and compliance, and I guess you have a bit of a broader regulatory role there. So we're thrilled to have you with us, Helena.
Thank you.
So with that, the topic for our discussion now is really to go into practice, to talk about, how do we make sure that what we do doesn't only look good on paper, but it has a real impact. And here I think we are well guided by the three questions from the DOJ. Is the program well designed? Is it applied in good faith? And does it really work? And I think it's this third piece, does it really work? And how do we make sure that it works, that we want to touch upon in this panel? And I have, Helena, the first question to you, since you have this broad spectrum that you have worked across. Whether you, Helena, have seen any particular challenge when it comes to, this work in practice?
Yeah, so from my perspective, when it comes to designing the program, it's really a matter of not being afraid to throw it all away and start over if you realize after 1 year that you haven't really hit the target and the challenges of the organization. Just clinging on to the previous panel discussion, I'm one of the few percentages that have a bit of a different role, since I cover a lot of areas in my role as compliance officer. So I'm also heading up sustainability and the legal team and safety and security and information security and risk management, amongst other things. So in my role as compliance manager, I'm also part of the management team of the Karolinska University Hospital. And that is, of course, a discussion in itself. But what I've seen is, and the way we have created our program today is really a challenge when it comes to covering what we have done. So just what I decided this week was that I will divide the program based upon the COSO framework. And that is also because the hospital where I'm working now is part of the Stockholm region. And the Stockholm region, when it comes to internal control, follow COSO. So everyone will understand what we're doing. But we have also decided to take a bit of a broader scope, as also talked about in the previous panel, and making sure to cover all of the areas that at the moment are part of the role that I have as a broader compliance exercise. But I think really there is a question of making sure to really write what we are doing and also take away the parts that we're not currently working with.
That is a challenge, right, when it also comes to limited resources and prioritization. And if we look at the survey. So we asked the question, what is the biggest challenge that you face? And well, not surprisingly, the biggest challenge is actually manual processes and lack of system support. And Derek, I'm sure you're not surprised. You have seen inside Nordic companies. I think we are pretty scattered and also have grown through acquisitions and so on. So there is not like one data pool that we can go into. But then the second biggest challenge is really the impact, the actual impact on culture and the business practices. And here, Agata, I want to sort of invite your perspectives here on the question and impact, and to make sure that we do not sort of remain in the second line or a bit distant from the business, because we know it's our impact, our value from our work is very limited if it's a nice paper program with limited impact. So, do you have any practical examples from really making sure that we have this impact?
Right, thank you so much, Anna. And I think it's a great question, and I think many of us here in this community basically try to crack this nut, because it's not that easy. But generally, I would just want to share my general reflections, and then we can, dig into deeper if you want to ask some for details. So, but I think we all want to make an impact. We want to create a positive change. We want to engage the employees, and in the big picture, basically to contribute to building culture of integrity and culture of responsible business conduct. So it's about impact and it's about culture, and these are very important words here, I think. And in addition, of course, it's about following policies and procedures, of course. But so again, how to go about it. So for me, I mean, over the years, I have sort of assessed and reflected on my experiences and what works, what doesn't work. But I think I came to the conclusion, I think we all get there. It's about really being a compliance officer, working with ethics and compliance in the organization. It's about really enabling the right business conduct throughout the organization. So we are there. I mean, it's about the employees in the line. So whatever we do, we have to do having our sort of target audience, so to say, in a simple way, in mind. So again, how to go about it. It's as a compliance officer, as a compliance team, it's of course important that we understand our organization, right? We understand the business, the risk exposures, we understand the culture. That's in a way prerequisite of making ourselves relevant for the business. We have to also be able to ask us questions, basically, why are we here? How do we add value? What is our purpose here? And basically, again, how to be relevant as a compliance officer or compliance team in the organization in times of increasing expectations and increasing legislations and regulations and high enforcement and new ESG agenda come into play, and also expectations of companies being able to know and show how they work with compliance internally as well as in the value chains. So I was reflecting a little bit, and I think there are like three main buckets I would like to touch upon to share my experiences. So first of all, I would say as a compliance officer, as a compliance team, you have to get the basics right. Make sure you have the compliance program in place, which is your tool and your sort of guiding star as to what you're gonna do. And make sure that this program is also relevant, that the program addresses the actual risk your company is facing. So basically, we end up with the understanding the business, the exposure. What are the business models? Do we use intermediaries or agents? How do we work in the supply chains? Do we engage into joint venture agreements? So understanding and being curious about this gives you a very good base to become relevant. Second of all is basically taking this paper wheel into the real life. And so basically working with implementation. Implementation meaning, for me, it's embedding compliance into business processes. Embedding, in a way, internal controls within certain processes like sales or procurement or HR or what have you, to make sure that we have checks and balances, that later on we can come back and monitor that, and also even audit. And we have data points for continuous improvement of the program and as an input to our risk assessments. So another important thing is really to be cautious and be careful about how you communicate, and really spend time on this, how you communicate the why to the organization. It's not only like we have this procedure and we have to follow. We have to make sure, we have to make an effort to explain the why, to explain the bigger picture. It's so much better to work, so much easier to communicate to people through explaining the backgrounds. And of course, the training is, I mean, it's training, it's sort of a part of the program that everyone, understands that it has to be there. But I think it's also very important to take time to design a good training to make sure that it addresses the right dilemmas, the right risks to the right target groups in the organization, because otherwise you might create some sort of compliance fatigue of constantly launching some programs, which we think it's fun to do, but it's basically taking people's time, and perhaps you're not gaining any impact, or you're not creating any impact in the organization with such trainings. And I think the third part is just, equally important as the two other parts is, as a function, we have to also understand, like, do we have a seat at the table? Like, are we a part of conversations, important conversations taking part in the organization? Are we part of the conversations when decisions are taken? So it is not always easy to have that seat at the table from the beginning, but I think the goal is to pave the way to create that seat at the table, that you are part of the right conversations. So I think it's also about, as a compliance officer, as a compliance team, to be empowered to take initiative and show leadership, because you have to look for good interfaces and cooperation partners, both within other corporate functions, to make sure that you can do more with the lean organization we have, but of course cooperate and be interactive towards the board, toward the management, regional management, to be sort of part of the conversations. So I think also, as a compliance officer, as a compliance team, it's a skill to be, in a way, you have to be into the nitty-gritty, but at the same time you have to be also able to see the big picture and where the strategy goes for the company. So I think it's also how to make an impact. I mean, it's about culture, it's about values and behaviors. And this way also is a good way to explain the why to the employees, just to make sure that we are all going the same direction. And it's not just kind of rule-based approach, but it is part of creating a responsible business conduct. So I would say it's about being relevant and about enabling the line and making positive change. That kind of boils down to those three, in a way, simple statements, but they are not that simple really to achieve in everyday life, but that happens over time. So I think that would be my take. And of course, you have different measurements, ways, surveys, etc., KPIs, but I think there are certain technicalities, but I think the gist is of working on the sort of bigger picture and creating a value-based, culture-based compliance program.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think that's great, Agatha. And I think also, as you said, one way of measuring if we are for real is to assess, there was a major decision, an acquisition that was going to be made, or maybe, my company is entering a new market. Was I there? Did they consult me in advance, or was it like, oh, we need to check with compliance as well? So I think that's a really good indicator. But Derek, from your perspective then, I mean, I know you have worked on these big monitorships and tested compliance programs that then are reported back, for example, to the US Department of Justice. Are there any obvious red flags that you would look at to see that a program only exists on paper? What would be indicators of that it's a paper program?
Yeah, so I mean, the kind of three things strike me. Maybe three is the magic number today, but the three things that strike me as well. So the first thing is looking at the design of the program. So, we'd expect to see a good risk assessment, a rigorous risk assessment, the resources of the compliance department lined up against the risk assessment, and obviously, correctly resourced, and the third thing is the board approving that. So that's kind of a top level. If you don't see that, and I've been in companies with very generic risk assessments and they haven't really considered how compliance lines up against the risk assessment, that's normally a kind of risk place to start. And so secondly then would be implementation. I mean, most companies have policies. I've very rarely seen a company without a policy, but it's really about what some of our colleagues on the panel have been talking about. How does it really come into real life business decisions? So we're looking at salespeople, talking to the sales team and asking them to explain how compliance interacts with their sales role, how it interacts with transaction approvals, how they bring compliance in for riskier transactions, how they know what a riskier transaction is. So there's real evidence, and it can be seen contemporaneously documented in the transaction documentation or the vendor onboarding papers or whatever it is. There's a clear sign that a compliance check has been made. It's been embedded in the process. So that's another good place to look. If you can't see that, then it's a sign for us that there are just policies. Maybe there's some training, but it's not really, the leadership of the business are not really driving these important ethical considerations when they're making real business decisions. And the third thing is testing. So usually in the DPA that goes with any settlement, particularly with the US government, there's a requirement that the company is testing its own compliance program. And it's back to that third question, which is my favorite out of all of the three questions. Does it work? And there's only one way really to know whether it works, and that's to test it. So there we typically see companies who set up specialist little groups to test transactions. So there might be a specific wing of the internal audit department that's specially trained to look for red flags, and they're looking at high risk transactions, third parties, distributors, service-related vendors, charitable donations, the typical kind of high-risk transactions, or maybe it's someone in the finance, a group in a finance shared service center who've also been trained to look for red flags, and they know what to do when they find one. They've had training about escalation and saying no and so on. So that testing program is really important, and from that testing program, a company can then extract findings. What control failed, what worked, what didn't work, what do we need to change back up at the top, or what do we need to embed into the systems. So those are really examples of looking at design implementation and effectiveness, and you're always looking for reality of things happening in an organization, not just, as you said, the paper program.
I think that's really good input, Derek. And as we can see from the survey, I mean, over 83% they do conduct risk assessments. So I think that is good. I think it's a given. Agatha, you were talking about the wheel and to get the basics in place. I mean, the first step is to do a risk assessment. And as you were saying, Helena, we need to focus. And what do we focus on? Well, we focus on the biggest risks. But the challenge there is then how this is done. And from the survey, we see that interviews with management is the most common method, and then review of documents. And then roughly half say that they do some form of data analytics and forensics. And I think if we look at regulatory guidance, the use of data is really key. And Derek, listening to you, that's where you find what's actually happening. But I do think we have to be honest in this group that access to data and quality of data and sort of completeness of data, it's a real struggle. So any quick tips from you, Derek, how to navigate this data issue?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult one. In most large international organizations, there is no panacea. There is no one source of data where you can kind of pull everything out. So for me, I actually like the stats you just showed. I think interviewing and talking to management teams about what they perceive the risks to be is really important. But then having access or being able to tap specific data sources for specific risks, I think that's the way to go. So that's where your friends in finance and your friends in sales and procurement start to come in very useful. And even internal audit for last year's testing results is going to find specific information about how many new distributors have we got third parties in our sales process, how many of them, and where are they? and which markets do they operate in, and so on. So it's your networking inside your own organizations to find where that data is, those specific data points that will then help color the risk assessment. But I don't think there's some great data panacea where you can, program something in a dashboard and it will all pop up. I've just very, very rarely seen that.
Helpful. So we shouldn't despair if we're struggling with this internally. Tay, we are sort of concluding this part, and Helena, I would like to extend the sort of final question to you, and really going back to this measuring and monitoring, and how do we report on what we do. And if we look at the survey again, the most common way to measure effectiveness is really internal audits. And then 1/3 roughly is doing some form of surveys or having mandatory tests after trainings. But then 1/3 as well says that, we don't measure at all the effectiveness. So this is a critical development area for all of us. And Helena, from your perspective, any good tips for the community on how we could go about here?
No, but I think as Derek spoke about, very important to use the information that we have. And I think what we all have seen in practice is that when things are going down in relation to finance in one part of the organization, the HR cases tend to go up, and often also the ethics cases. So I think we can do quite a lot just with basic data to follow trends, to see areas to focus on going forward, but also using the existing friends in the organization, that, as also mentioned in the previous panels, the colleagues within HR. Is it something there that we can add on when it comes to questions to ask to the organization, or what specific data can we get from our friends working in finance and so on? I don't think we need to create that many big programs or changes to start with, but just digging where we are and using the data that the organization can provide us with can give us quite a good overview if we make sure to collaborate and then make everyone our best friends.
Long time. We've only scratched the surface of really making sure that what we do sticks and is effective. But we need to move on to talk a little bit more about what the future holds for ethics and compliance. But I do want to thank you all so much for participating in the discussion. And the discussion can sort of continue online in the chat as well. But thank you, Derek, Agata, and Helena, for your participation so far.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What I like most with my work is coming together cross-functionally and solving some of the most challenging and complicated issues my company faces. And in doing so, building a stronger business and a better society. I hope to see you all around soon.
To be honest, ethics and compliance can be rather boring if we only concentrate on drafting rules, processes, try to control our employees, and try to avoid risks. But if we instead would see ethics and compliance as an opportunity, where we empower our employees with trust to act with integrity, then ethics and compliance is a fantastic work task. This is how we try to do it in Stora Enso. This is key to achieving our strategic ambitions. And if I can contribute to the success of the company by creating a winning ethical culture, that's the best part of ethics and compliance. See you around.
The best thing with my job in ethics and compliance are investigations. They require a broad range of skills and wide experience. They are always different and never get boring. Although it might feel like a marathon every now and then before you actually can get to the conclusions, it's always rewarding.
One nice thing about working with ethics and compliance is that you feel like you're on the cutting edge of thought on the role that corporations have, not just to their shareholders and to investors, but to the society at large. And today, public distrust in companies can seem quite high because of recent scandals. At the same time, there are very, very strong expectations on organizations and corporations to make certainly the milieu where they operate a better place. If you work in ethics and compliance, essentially you are trying to respond to those expectations, and which means in some small way from within the company, you're trying to make the world a better place. And that's really wonderful. And that's probably one of the best things about this role. A great thing about working with ethics and compliance is that everyone wants to work in an environment that is ethical, where you know your colleagues and the leaders operate with ethical values and do the right thing. And so when you work in compliance, you're essentially working with the same goals that everybody else in the company has. Everybody wants to work in an environment like that. And so it's very nice to be able to have an alignment of goals where what you want and what everybody else wants is exactly the same thing. And I think that gives a certain tenor and tone to meetings and makes it very positive. You always have people support, you always have leadership support, and that makes it a very, very pleasant thing to do on a day-to-day basis.
So the best thing about working with ethics and compliance is really that we can have an impact, and I do think we should seize that opportunity. And now for the final part of this event, we are gonna have an investor perspective, because we know that many times money talks, and investors, what they ask for, the requirements they have on companies make a huge difference. I think we all can testify to that when we have board of directors that are pushing for certain things, things do happen. And for this last part, we are going to touch upon the topic of ESG, environment, social and governance, which is a topic that has been first discussed in the investor community when investors are trying to cater for what was called externalities. So external aspects impacting companies, and investors try to measure that in some way or form, not only measuring the financial results and indicators, but other indicators as well. And this is where ESG now has come to the scene, and it's been discussed within the investor community for over a decade, but it's just during the last years that this really has become mainstream. And during the next 10 to 15 minutes, we have invited a real expert to the scene on ESG. So Jakob Raunborg from Frank Partners. We are really thrilled to have you here. I mean, you have conducted due diligences from an ESG perspective, among others for private equity firms, and have some really interesting perspectives to share with us today. So Jakob, I'm super happy that you are with us here today.
So in terms of, I wanted to touch about maybe the general drivers for an increased interest in ESG. And I would highlight 4 general drivers that really play a role here. The first might seem kind of obvious, but it's nonetheless key. There's an increasing realization that climate change is real. And you see that reflected in IPCC reports, media coverage on extreme weather, but also that companies need to play a huge role in addressing the issue. Secondly, I would say societal pressures are really causing a difference. Movements such as Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and that's really pushed a shift towards diversity and equality in companies. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly from an investment perspective, is the financial impact. And having a credible ESG program is becoming essential for valuations and IPOs these days. If you have a credible program, if you operate business lines that can show ESG impacts, then this will positively impact company valuations. And this is not just an easy thing to say. It's actually, and it's not just a small adjustment. It's actually quite a significant multiple if you speak to investors and investment banks these days. And finally, something I would say is still very important is regulation, and the ESG movement has kind of, in some ways, I would say, preceded regulations. It's kind of gotten a life of its own, but of course, investors are still very much looking at upcoming regulations, and the anticipation of regulations is very much driving them as well, especially incoming EU regulation, which is definitely showing some teeth. If we move on to kind of the experiences that the topics that investors are most interested in, something that we've discussed in the past, Anna, and whether they're satisfied with paper programs or actually looking for real impact. I think I would when you speak to investors, it's very clear, anything to do with climate change, carbon footprints, energy transition, they're all top of the agenda. They occupy the top spots, the top 1 to 5 spots. And so it's a resounding focus on the E and ESG amongst investors at the moment. The other topic that is garnering a lot of interest, and where there has been a lot of development in recent years, and that will continue so, is gender equality and diversity. I think in the Nordics, it's probably more connected to gender as opposed to ethnic diversity that is on the top of the agenda. I would say, considering the wealth of new supply chain regulations coming into place, I think that it's still surprisingly low on the agenda of investors in general. Of course, it varies a lot across different industries. So, of course, if you're involved in low-skilled manual labor or precious metals, of course, it would rank higher. But overall, this is definitely an area that is up and coming and will continue to increase in the future. In terms of,
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, Anna. Yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry. I just wanted to pose you a question there, Jacob. Sure. When it comes to this, when you were saying the interest from investor and what they are looking for, and that perhaps it could be higher on the agenda. Like when you do a due diligence, then and in an M&A transaction, for example. How can you there judge that the policies are for real? If we connect a little bit to the previous panel, what would you look for? And also then, I think for all of us working with ethics and compliance, we see M&A transactions as a big source of risk. Do you then have some common pitfalls to share with us, and something that we should be specifically careful about when it comes to M&As?
Yeah, I would. It's a good question. I think there's 3 core areas that I see as part of this. Of course, there could be plenty more, but they really work well together. And the first is, you obviously need to review the actual policies. Do they address the right things? Do they have enough details on practical steps to take by employees or third parties? Is there a training element? Is there an escalation model? We touched upon a lot of these topics already. And, for example, you see that quite often with whistleblower mechanisms, that, a company will say they have one, especially smaller companies that we look at in PE setting, and, but really it's just writing that employees should report issues to their manager without any details on process or how this can be done anonymously. A second one is the Q&A with the relevant managers when from sales side. Here you really have an opportunity to ask about questions about policies, address gaps, ask about any informal practices in place that you gather the whole picture. And thirdly, I would say it's discrete interviews with former employees. This is really where the investigative approach comes into play and has a real benefit, because if you speak to former staff that have recently left and they've never heard about ABC guidelines or heard anything from the top management about these issues, then you can be pretty sure that they haven't been implemented. So that's where you see an implementation gap often in our cases.
Great. Yeah.
And maybe to touch on the biggest pitfall I would see. I mean, it's often that the M&A teams can be a bit blinded by the opportunity. Of course, they're focused on the commercial opportunity at hand, and that obviously means that the risk sometimes not properly evaluated or taken into account because it looks so attractive. And of course, there's a bit of a natural conflict here, because you have a large deal team that's been working on this deal for months, and then suddenly you come in and say, look at all these risks that we haven't considered. So that's why we often say to and advise our own customers to really take ESG considerations into account at a much earlier stage. I mean, it's not particularly difficult to see if a target has a big supply chain element in emerging markets, or sells a lot of products to public customers in China, so that it's already going to be there, and you're not going to be blindsided by it at a later stage.
Exactly, and isn't it so? Risk and opportunity, it's sort of the flip side of the same coin. And when it comes to, for example, environmental risks, you can acquire quite substantial liabilities, and if you're not aware of that, how do you manage that going forward? Or if you acquire a company that is highly dependent on agents, and the business model is really to sell through these agents, and they have been vastly successful, and then when those agents are going through your screening process, you can no longer work with them. You may destroy the whole business case. So I think ESG aspects are critical in acquisitions. But Jacob, how do you now see this current debate or discussion around ESG? Because I can see that within the ethics and compliance community, we're sort of trying to find our space. And I could see also in the chat here, somebody had commented upon, sustainability and the obvious link to compliance. There is more and more regulation coming out, so there is an element, something to comply with. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the link between ESG and ethics and compliance, and the role that we as ethics and compliance professionals can play here, or should play?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that somebody connected to sustainability. That would probably be the furthest away from what I would associate or connect the E&C with ESG. I mean, I think you're already dealing with 1/3 of ESG, right? I mean, the governance function, or the governance part of an ESG due diligence and ESG in general in practice is very much what E&C function does already. So you're already performing a crucial ESG role within the company. Beyond that, I think that the two most obvious areas for me, in terms of a fit perspective and impact, are related to supply chain and M&A. And we just spoke about M&A. So just in terms of the supply chain side, I believe that sourcing and procurement could really do with a dose of E&C suspicion. We are naturally suspicious on our side, and one of my general experiences has been an over-reliance on accepting information from suppliers and not establishing the veracity of this through other means than audits and engagements. Now, of course, those audits and engagement are very important, but you could still have a blind spot. What if your supplier actually subcontracts work to someone else with much lower labor standards? This is something we've seen before. And E&C are very used to seeing sales agents ticking the box that they don't pay bribes. But I mean, of course, we don't trust that and automatically accept that. But of course, as some of the panelists said before, you have to break through those silos. And I think that, of course, that's one of the tricky areas here in, where I see E&C having the biggest impact is within other silos within the corporation. So really the impacts and really depend on whether you can jump over those silos and work together.
Yeah, no, I think that's brilliant. I mean, what we then sort of to summarize, what you think we can contribute is really to work cross-functionally and make sure we work with all the stakeholders in the organization. And then secondly, to have this systematic approach that we have and sort of trust, but at the same time verify what we see. We have a question, Jacob, from on the line here. So I think we could start wrapping up with that question, and it sort of comes to what the future holds for ESG. And we have Richard, who is asking. So Jacob, do you see any new uptrending compliance areas that we should start looking at? So, for example, cryptocurrency or payment in cryptos or age discrimination. So, what are your what does your crystal ball says in this regard?
I mean, cryptocurrency, I mean, that's an interesting one. I have to admit, I'm not an expert in cryptocurrency. I mean, I would say this, though, that there's going to be a massive development in the next couple of years in ESG. I mean, if you look at it, it's still a very immature, a very underdeveloped area. And, you know, the debate is going to get heated, and, you know, it's already getting heated, and it's going to get even more heated as it goes bigger and bigger. And, you know, there's going to be people that abuse it, you know, greenwashing, etc. But it is going to be essential for businesses to have an ESG program as part of their business strategy. And I think that, you know, this is something that's, you know, comes down a lot to financial impact, because we're already seeing that financial impact. You know, the capital flows are not going to coal, they're not going to all the big polluters. They are going to the ones that can adapt, the one that can transition into a new use of energy that has a positive impact on climate change. So I think that's what you'll see. You'll see an increase in ESG, and you will, as E&C professionals, you will also be getting much more downward pressure because, you know, investors are going to put more pressures on your management. Then the management is going to figure out, okay, where we're going to push this new responsibilities, how's that? And so it's going to come down your way. So, you know, I think everybody who wants to be at the forefront and really understand what's happening, they need to do a lot of homework and to do a lot of reading and a lot of research to stay at the forefront, because what we're seeing now is going to look extremely different just in a years or 2 years time. So it's a fast moving sector, and people are still just grappling with it.
Oh, great. I could not agree more, Jacob. And I think that's why we should do our risk assessments. We should be skeptical and sort of stay on top, because this is an ever evolving field. But time flies when you have fun. I can't believe we've almost spent 2 hours here. So thank you, Jacob. Thank you, everybody who has participated, both those who have responded to the survey, but also participated to this community event. So Nina, how would we summarize an event, an amazing afternoon like this?
Yeah, I guess the thing is that we are never ready with this story, and really good conversations and really good many new fresh ideas for our forthcoming events and ethics talks, which reminds me of that we still have 3 more episodes coming up this year on ethics talk. So we're going to talk about also things that we talked today, so about human rights, about anti-corruption, and about the real purpose of ethics and compliance, which will be a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, so the next ethics talk is in October
12th.
October 12th. So sign up for that. We will really question ourselves. You know, what is the purpose of our work? Is it really to fulfill the regulations? And yeah, who is the main stakeholder here? So that will be a super interesting discussion. And then we will dive into human rights. And I actually, to sort of conclude from my side, I coincidentally, Nina, I listened to a talk from Niels Meltzer, who is a special rapporteur at UN, and he was asked for some general advice, and I don't even remember the question he was responding to, but what he said was that we should never attach ourselves to a function, but to our integrity. And that was really striking for me, and I thought, yes, that's really brilliant for all of us. So let's not attach ourselves to our functions, even if we love working with ethics and compliance and being the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer or the VP for compliance or whatever the title is. Let's not attach ourselves to that function, but to our integrity, because when the function is gone, we still will have our integrity left. But if our integrity is gone, I think we all know where that is heading. So I thought that was really inspirational for me, and I will keep holding on to my integrity.
That's a great way to end today's session. And once more, thank all of our great partners. Without you, this would have not been possible, but also this would not be existing without the great members that we have. So once more, thank you for joining the event. Thank you for participating to the survey and to the discussion, and the discussion will continue.